Hello, everyone. First and foremost, thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for our monthly Prime Money Moves webinar. Again, as a shameless plug, these webinars are hosted monthly and are open to the public, so spread the word to your peers if you find these helpful, and be sure to fill out that survey at the end of our session to give us ideas on what else you'd like to learn more about. My name is Kenji Noguchi, and I'll be your host for today. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to demystify the home buying journey. Rules of thumb to use, actual formulas, numbers, and the entire process so that you can make this major life decision with confidence. If questions come up along the way, drop them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. We have 8 topics today, and they're sequenced to build on each other. We'll start with the cost comparison, renting versus buying right now, then the break-even math, and a quick read on current market conditions. Because the real question isn't, is buying cheaper? It's when does buying become worth it, and in what kind of market? From there, we'll explore 4 formulas that the CFP might actually use to evaluate readiness, closing costs, the number most people forget to plan for, and then we'll dive into the mechanics, the full home buying process, including mortgage pre-approval, loan types, when refinancing makes sense, and down payment scenarios with real numbers. We'll close with a readiness assessment and the specific questions you need to be able to answer before you sign anything. So by the end of today, folks, you'll be able to answer 5 things. How much can you realistically afford? What pre-approval actually involves? What costs to plan for beyond your down payment? When that refinancing makes sense, and what to do right now to prepare. So we'll go ahead and start with the numbers. Renting versus buying. Now here's a headline that gets a lot of attention. As of February 2026, the median asking rent in the top 50 metros has fallen to about $1,667 a month. Now folks, that's the lowest level in 4 years and the 30th straight month of year-over-year declines. And this is all according to Realtor.com. So the average monthly cost to buy a starter home, principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, you name it, roughly about $2,800. And if we just take the difference between those two, that's $1,141 a month. So renting is cheaper in pure cash flow terms in most major markets right now. And that gap is actually widened as rents continue to get softened, new builds come out, and seasonality plays a part in that too. But really, here's a framing that most people miss, okay? If you're renting and investing the difference, that's $1,141 a month, compounding at 7% over 10 years. And that can grow to nearly $200,000. So that's not nothing, all right? That's a down payment on a future home, a healthy emergency fund, maybe even meaningful retirement contributions all at once. But, and this is the critical part, those savings only materialize if the money actually gets invested, right? If that $1,000 extra goes towards lifestyle instead, well, the math flips entirely. The bottom line here, renting isn't throwing money away, and buying isn't automatically building wealth. It depends entirely on what you do with that gap. So let's look at exactly when buying starts to win. And how do we measure that? Well, I use the break-even point. And the break-even point is the moment your accumulated cost of owning finally drops below what you would have paid for in rent over that same period. And until you cross that line, renting is generally the financially smarter choice, even if buying feels like the right move emotionally. The formula is simple here, folks. We'll take our total upfront costs, down payment plus closing costs, and we'll divide by our monthly savings from owning versus renting. And that number is going to give us how many months until we break even. So we'll walk through this base scenario. Let's say we have a $350,000 home, 10% down. Today's rate of 6 3/4. Your monthly cost to own runs about $2,067 versus $1,400 in comparable rent. So what's the difference? What's our monthly gap? It's $667. Your total upfront cost, $35,000 for a down payment. Closing costs, $10,500. A total of $45,500. We divide that by 667 and we find our break even. If we took this deal, we'd break even at 68 months or 5.7 years. Let's paint this picture even further. Let's use a stretch scenario. I'll call this. What if we bought a house, $500,000 at just 5% down? When we use this break-even formula, it actually breaks even faster, right? 26 months or 2.2 years. And the reason for this is that comparable rent at that price point is just much higher. So the monthly savings gap is bigger. Now, one thing I want to be careful about here is, a faster break-even doesn't mean the stretch scenario is a better financial choice, right? So I don't want anyone walking away here thinking, so I should buy more house with less down because Kenji told me to. Not quite, right? It breaks even faster simply because the dollar gap between owning and renting is bigger at that higher price point, and bigger numbers move math faster in both directions, right? And maybe what this break-even point number doesn't show you is when a stretch scenario of $500,000 home, that also means we're going to have a higher loan instead of the $350,000 home, maybe a higher monthly payment instead of the $2,000, and only a 5% equity cushion instead of something higher, maybe like 10. What I'm really saying here, folks, right? We have much less room for error if home values dip or if your incomes change. A shorter break even on a bigger, thinner margin isn't an automatic green light for you to go stretch your budget, okay? It's one input, and we have to weigh it against some of our other rules of thumb that we'll touch on here later in the deck. So put a pin in that. But again, break even should not be used just to justify a bigger purchase. The takeaway here is if you're not planning to stay at least as long as your break even point, renting is almost certainly the better financial choice for you, okay? Buying a home you'll sell in 2 years isn't wealth building strategies. That's an expensive transaction. There's one more factor that might shape this math, okay? The market you're buying into. A lot of people ask us all the time, what is a buyer's market? What's a seller's market? So we'll break it down here. A buyer's market is simply when supply exceeds demand, right? You have leverage. Homes sit longer. You can negotiate inspections, repairs, maybe even get rate buy downs. A seller's market is the exact opposite, right? Homes are moving fast. There's multiple offers out there. Buyers are waiving contingencies just to get their name thrown in the hat. There's 3 numbers that I think will tell you almost everything about which kind of market you're currently in: months of supply, days on market, and the list to sale ratio. So let's spend a moment on that last one specifically, because I think it's the most direct read on what's my negotiating power here? Where am I at in the market? A list to sale ratio compares a home's final sale price to its original asking price expressed as a percentage. So say a home is listed at $400,000. If it sells for $388,000, well, that's a list to sale ratio of 97%, right? 400,000 divided by 388. The seller accepted 3% less than what they asked for. If that same home sells for $412,000, well, that's a ratio of 103%. Buyers competed and pushed the price 3% above asking. And you folks know I love rules of thumb, so I'll give you one right here, right? When the average ratio across a market dips below that 97%, aka sellers are accepting discounts, right? That signals, hey, we might be, or we are in a buyer's market. We'll have a little bit of room to negotiate price, maybe get repairs requested. Heck, we can even ask for closing cost credits. Okay, when that average ratio is above 100%, buyers are routinely paying over asking just to win, right? It's a seller's market. We won't have the same leverage. We're going to compete on price. Maybe it's timeline, or heck, we're going to say we don't need some of these contingencies just because we need the deal done. And I'd say right now, generally, market conditions vary widely by where you're at and where you're buying. But some areas have shifted towards buyers, many haven't. It's worth checking your own area's numbers before assuming either way. And again, that context is going to directly affect how much negotiating room you think you'll have. And I always feed that right back into our break-even number. Okay. Buyer's market can shrink those upfront costs, maybe through negotiated concessions, and a seller's market's going to push them way higher. So hopefully that helps. And again, just to give us a pulse on, when does buying start to pay off, and, what type of market are we currently in? Let's go ahead and talk about the math that's actually going to determine, are we financially ready to buy at all? So these are the 4 formulas I actually use, or, any fiduciary advisor should be using these when evaluating when someone should buy a home. So let's go through these quickly here. The price to rent ratio is probably the most useful number for gauging whether a market favors buying or renting. So what we'll do is divide the home price by the annual rent for a comparable property. If it's under 15, hey, that might make some strong financial sense, right? If it's over 20, well, renting likely wins. And I'd say in many markets right now, we're all kind of in that gray, what if gray zone of in between 15 and 20, where again, that decision, should I buy? It's going to depend on your personal situation. So again, it's worth running these numbers for yourself, your area, and then just understanding, where am I at in life? Am I actually ready here? The second rule we'll look at, the 28 and 36 rule. This is truly what lenders are going to use to qualify you, right? Now I use it, and my hope is other advisors use it as a wealth protection guardrail, right? We don't want any more than 28% of our gross income used on housing. And in fact, we don't want more than 36% of our total income or gross income on total debt combined. Now, a lender might approve you, right, up to 43% total debt to income. Just because they approve you doesn't mean it's a good financial decision, right? We want to hold the line at the 28 and the 36. So let's put a real number on this of why that actually might make sense, right? Let's say your household income is $80,000. Now, roughly that's about, call it $6,600 gross a month. 28% of that would come out to about $1,800. And we'll always want to keep aside a reasonable amount, taxes, insurance, maintenance. So let's call it, we'll say it's $400 to $500 a month. And again, that's going to vary by your location there, folks. But if we take that $1,800, the 28% gross, and we take out, the estimated taxes, insurance, and maintenance, what are we left with? About $1,400 for principal and interest. And that's the exact number we would use to reverse engineer the equation, right? And exactly what lenders are doing. They're going to say, okay, well, if that's how much free cash flow is here, what's our going rate on a 30-year loan? Let's say the rate is 6 3/4, 30 years, $1,400 a month extra. We could probably qualify you for a loan of up to $200,000, right? But we're going to want to add our down payment on top of that. Maybe if we're using FHA, we have 3.5% down. Well, that loan support a home price of about $225,000, and maybe if we increase our down payment to 20%, nonetheless, we're still going to be around $275,000. Really, the math is going to change of how much you put down, and you're going to be realistically looking at homes in that specific range. But when we use 28 and 36, right, again, it's a starting point to say, where's our cash flow going and why? Reverse engineer that. Let's find a price that we can actually afford, that we can actually go and shop with. Okay. Now, true monthly cost of ownership is a number most buyers underestimate. The mortgage payment, it's just the beginning, right? Budget 1% of your home's value annually for maintenance. Let's say, on a $400,000 home, about $300 a month. Add property taxes, insurance. Heck, if you got an HOA, right, the true cost runs an extra maybe $500 to $850 a month on top of your mortgage payment alone. Okay. And the very last thing I always like to do is the opportunity cost check. Every dollar you put into a down payment is a dollar that's no longer compounding in the market. On a $40,000 down payment growing at a, call it 8% market return, it's about $3,200 a year, or, roughly $86,000 over 10 years. Now, simply, it's just, and it's, well, I guess where I'm going here, folks, is it's not an argument against buying, right? It's simply a real cost that I think deserves to be part of the conversation and part of that equation. Okay. Now, good question. I got a question from John. Is gross income before or after income tax? That would be before. So again, right, that's maybe where a lender or banks, they've gotten really good at this, where they might trick you to say, well, hey, you qualify, right? We might pre-qualify you for a higher balance, even if your net actual paycheck, that is the bank, isn't going to be that much. Put a pin in that. We'll circle to more of that soon, John, I promise. But again, all of these formulas for me, I think are the backbone of any readiness conversation I have, or that I know all of the great advisors here at Prime Capital have. So let's put this together, right? Let's talk about a catch that almost everyone misses. Closing cost, right? One of the most consistently overlooked pieces of the home buying equation. And, they constantly trip up first-time buyers. So when someone tells me, hey, you know what, Kenji, I've saved my down payment, we're ready to buy, let's pull the trigger, right? The first thing I ask is, hey, have you saved for closing costs? A lot of people look at me, raise an eyebrow and go, no. Well, this is important, right? This is something we just can't forget about. So let's make this real, and let's use an example. I'll say we have a buyer. Her name is Maria. She wants to buy a $400,000 home. She wants to put 10% down, right? So what's her down payment? $40,000. Now, closing costs are typically going to run 2 to 5% of the loan amount. So for a conventional purchase like Maria's, right, 3%, it's probably the average typical number, works out to about $11,400. So Maria's actual cash needed at the closing table is not just $40,000 for the down payment, right? It's that extra $11,400 in closing costs. So a total cost to close, $51,400. Now, the reason I point this out is, I think a lot of people, that's the goal they set for themselves of, this is the down payment I need to reach. So let me just be maybe that bearer of good news or maybe bad news of there are more other costs and we need to be cognizant of them. Okay. And there's another cost too. I think that often gets missed entirely, and that's escrow reserves, right? Lenders typically want 2 to 5 months of property taxes, insurance, all of that set aside before their first payment. So again, right, Maria's annual bill might just be even getting higher if we add in some of those different things. And I think these are the numbers nobody warns people about, right? I think a lot of times lenders or banks, most of the time they might glance over these things sometimes just to, hey, let's close the deal, right? But if it's one thing I want you to walk away remembering here, folks, is your real cash to close is your down payment plus your closing costs plus your escrow. Treat it all as one combined savings goal, not just the down payment. Okay, please, and you'll pat yourself on the back and be happy you did. The message to all this is, ask your lender for a loan estimate early in the process. They're going to spell it out, every single one of these line items, every single one of these costs in writing. And it might look like the slide up here, but really what's the goal here? We just don't want any surprises. We want to know what we're paying for and why. So now that we have broken down a little bit of, what are the costs to get into a home, let's walk through exactly how that home buying process unfolds step by step. And we'll break it all down with ease here. I think, most people have a pretty general or vague sense of how a home purchase works, right? Like, hey, I get qualified, let me get financing, I'll put money down. I don't think many have just really seen the full sequence laid out until they sit down with a lender, right? And I think this slide directly answers one of the questions we hear most is, what should I be doing right now to prepare for this? And step one is all about the financial foundation, right? It's, ideally, you're giving yourself 6 to 12 months before you buy. We're going to pull credit reports, we're going to pay down debts, we're going to save for both the down payment and all those closing costs at the same time. And we're going to be a good cookie and budget out for this. Step two is pre-approval. And I'll spend a little extra time here because I think it's, one of those misunderstood steps in the process. Pre-qualification and pre-approval, they're not one and the same. They're different, right? Pre-qualification is just a quick estimate based on what you tell the lender. It's unverified. It's not binding. It's not meaningful. I always think of pre-qualification of kind of like, when credit card companies will send you that packet in the mail saying, hey, you're pre-qualified. I'll give you $100K for 100,000 miles. Right? It's not binding until you actually get approved, sign the paperwork, and then that lender is actually verifying your income, reviewing your tax returns, pulling your credit, and confirming the assets that you have, right? So pre-qualification, quick estimate, pre-approval, full scrub down, verified. And it's worth a note, you know, in a competitive market, most sellers won't even look at offers without a pre-approval in hand. So it's something to be aware of. Lenders evaluate 4 things when they determine your pre-approval. I call them the 4 C's, right? The first is capacity. Is your income relative to your debt? Capital. What is your savings and reserves at? Credit. Is your score live? Are you good with your payment history? What's your utilization rate at? And collateral. Is the property itself confirmed by the appraisal, right? And, you know, I think another thing, you know, that sometimes might surprise people is how directly your credit score has a direct measurable effect on your interest rate, right? The difference between, let's say, a 680 score and a 760 score can maybe be, you know, 3/4 of a percentage point or more. It adds up over time. So, you know, I think what I tell folks is, hey, if your score is in the mid 600s, it genuinely is worth waiting maybe 6 months to a year to improve it before you apply. Quick question from Shanta, and absolutely, this is going to be recorded. I know this is a ton of information, so rest assured, we'll have all these recorded and sent out to everyone too. Circling back here, right, a few practical rules. I think once you're pre-approved, don't open new credit cards, don't change jobs, don't make large purchases before closing, right? Any of those things might derail a loan that's already been approved for you. So maybe another helpful point, multiple mortgage inquiries within a 45-day window count as a single inquiry on your credit report. So it's worth shopping 2 or 3 lenders before you commit. Okay. Step 3 is the search and offer process, right? Your buyer's agent, typically paid by the seller, no cost to you to use one, so use one. You know, you're going to have earnest money down 1 to 3% of the purchase price. And that is all going to go along with your offer and gets credited towards your cost of closing, right? This is a shop around phase here, is what they say. And then we move forward to getting under contract, usually 30 to 45 days. And this is where your inspection happens, right? Kind of your last real negotiating window, I call it. Let's make sure all of our T's are crossed and our I's dotted here. And that's when the lender is going to order the appraisal to confirm the home supports the loan amount. And where do we get to, right? End of the process. Well, it's closing day. Let's review all the disclosures. Let's make sure every line is tuned up. Let's send and wire our funds over, sign the paperwork, and woohoo, I'm a homeowner. I got my keys, right? I think if there's anything, or at least one thing from this slide I want you folks to remember this. The preparation work in step 1 is going to determine how smoothly everything after it goes. That's going to be the single most actionable thing. You can start this week. And again, that's what we're here for. That's why we do these monthly webinars. We're here to be a resource to help you folks. So have that conversation with us, talk with your advisor, and let's get you aligned so you are financially prepared for a big life change like buying a home. Now that we know about the full process and exactly what pre-approval requires, let's talk about the financing decision, right? This is probably going to affect our payment more than anything else. What type of loan should we choose? And this is where I really want to demystify some of these loan types because, heck, there's a lot of acronyms here that trip people up. You know how we like to do it in the financial industry, give you acronyms and confuse you. But especially PMI versus MIP. You know, these are not the same thing, and the difference matters a lot. So I like to use examples here. Let's make this real with 2 neighbors. Let's assume both are buying the same $380,000 home with 5% down on the same exact day. Neighbor 1, they go with a conventional loan. So she pays PMI, private mortgage insurance, at about $190 a month. Once she reaches 20% equity, usually around year 5, maybe through pay down and appreciations, she can ask to cancel it, or by law, it's going to automatically disappear at 22% equity either way. So the total cost for maybe neighbor one going conventional, with a PMI of 190 a month over 5 years, it's roughly 11,400, and then it's gone. It's gone for good. We'll flip the script here. Let's say neighbor two, same exact amount, right? $380 home, 5% down on the same day what the rates are giving us, but they go with the FHA loan. And they're going to pay MIP, mortgage insurance premium. And it works very differently, right? Like you're going to have an upfront fee of that added straight to the loan balance at closing just to originate the loan. And then that MIP is ongoing. And let's say in this scenario with the math, it's about $193 a month. And because you put down less than 10% on an FHA, right, that monthly MIP is never going to cancel. It's never going away. Not at 20% equity, not at 22%, right? Not ever. The only way out of that is refinancing into a conventional loan once there's enough equity built. So put a pin in that. We'll come back to that, I promise. But the message here is, right, the same home, the same down payment, similar buyers over 10 years. The neighbor two who went with FHA is going to be paying about $29,000 in MIP versus neighbor one's $11,400 in PMI. Difference between those two is $18,000 just on loan type, even with all other variables exactly the same. Okay. So for someone with strong credit and maybe some savings, a conventional loan at 3 to 5% down, in my opinion, almost always makes more sense than an FHA, specifically because of that MIP permanence. FHA truly does shine for borrowers with credit scores in the 580 to call it 620 range who can't qualify for a conventional, right? And maybe for them, FHA is the door that's actually open, even with the higher long-term cost. And, I think if you or a family member served in the military, right, take a serious look at VA loans. No mortgage insurance at all, just a one-time funding fee. And heck, these have become so much more common, as all buyers are kind of looking for any edge on affordability. Maybe another niche one is USDA. Those exist too. Eligible for rural and suburban areas, 0 down. Now that's a small slice of the market. So, it's more of a know it exists than a plan around it option, I'd say, for most of us. But I think those are two other helpful options that we certainly shouldn't ignore. So let's go back to that FHA lifetime MIP problem, right? Well, okay, if refinancing is our only way out of it, right? Well, what should we do, right? Like, what does that actually mean? Well, and I think I'll just answer it here directly, right? Refinancing means replacing your existing mortgage with a new one. A rate and term refinance changes only the rate or the term. No cash out, right? Okay, we're just going to get a better rate and a better deal, save our cash flows. And it's typically worth considering, I'd say, usually the rule of thumb I use is, hey, when rates drop, 0.5%, 1% below than what we're currently paying, yeah, that probably makes sense for us to go ahead and do a rate and term refinance. What's the other one we all hear? A cash out refinance, right? A cash out refi. Well, what that is it lets you borrow more than what you owe and you take the difference in cash. And, where is this actually useful in like real life, right? Renovations, home improvements, maybe debt consolidation, right? The reality is that is going to increase your loan balance. Usually you're capped at an 80% loan to value, but absolutely, right? That's an option of refinancing. Now, really the math, I think, for deciding whether a refinance makes sense, it uses the same break-even logic we just talked about for buying, right? We're going to say, what's our closing cost divided by the monthly savings we'd have? So let's say, hey, refinancing costs us $5,000. And if that's eliminating that $193 a month MIP payment that we just talked about in the FHA example, well, that's roughly, right, a 26-month break even, 5,000 divided by 193. Hey, if we refinance, we're going to want to stay in this place for 26 months. Okay. So if you're staying in the home longer than that, it's worth doing. And, again, folks, this is what we're here for. We're happy to run this exact math for you in a one-on-one or a conversation. So let's put some real numbers behind all of these. And let's see how the down payment you choose now changes everything else we've just talked about, right? A lot of moving parts. But I think this is where we make things concrete, right? Run the numbers. Let's see what the net effect is. And maybe we can make some trade-offs and use strategy to our help here. So one $400,000 home, 4 different down payment choices. Watch what happens as the down payment increases. The monthly principal and interest drops. And for conventional loans, mortgage insurance eventually disappears, entirely at the 20% down. The 3.5% FHA option, right on the left-hand side, that has the lowest cash to close, right? And I think that's why it's so attractive to a lot of us in today's time, right? It's tough paying bills. I get it. You know, credit, it's up through the roof. So a lot of folks are emotionally maybe saying, hey, this is the lowest cash to close, right? But maybe it's the highest long-term cost. Again, don't forget about some of those hidden costs when we do these. We'll have MIP on this. We'll have that monthly charge that won't go away. And over 5 years in place, that's, 11 grand and some change in just MIP alone. And that's on top of a higher payment from the larger loan balance we had to take. The 20% conventional option requires the most upfront cash, right? $80,000 here. But that carries the lowest monthly payment at $2,074, zero mortgage insurance. Here's the framing I really want you guys to think about, right? The difference between putting 3.5 down and 20% down is $66,000, right? So the real question really is, what's the better use of that $66,000? Put it into the house? Do I keep it or do I invest it, right? So let's, I love playing devil's advocate. Let's look at both sides here. First, right, if we invested that $66,000, instead of putting it down, right, let's assume, hey, we make 7% average return over 10 years. What does that grow to? Roughly about $130,000. So we have a gain of about $64,000. That's the upside of keeping our cash. Okay, but keeping the cash and investing means we're financing, call it $66,000 more, which is exactly why the smaller down payment option has that extra $822 a month we see on the slide there. That's not just MIP, it's also the interest on the bigger loan balance. So over 10 years, $822 adds up to about $98,000 and some change in extra payments. So this is where I'm going here. Let's compare those two, right? If we invested $66,000, well, we'll net out about roughly $64,000. But if you carry the bigger loan, that's going to cost us about $98,640 in the long run. That $98,640 minus the 64, right? The extra payments that we're going to pay is about $35,000 more than what the investment would be gaining us. So I think in this specific case, right, the cost of carrying the extra debt is higher than the return we've earned by investing instead. So putting more down and avoiding the MIP altogether might actually be the stronger financial move for you, not the more conservative one. And I say all this with a little caveat, cherry on top, to say, right, if you're putting 20% down, means that's you draining your emergency fund, skipping retirement contributions, taking early withdrawals, right? The math changes completely, and don't do that. Liquidity and stability have their own value that I don't think show up in this, this calculation or this comparison, right? But it's exactly this kind of analysis which runs against your real income, your real savings, and real timeline is precisely what we want you to be aware of. Now, I know there's a lot of questions coming in here on the chat, so rest assured, I will go ahead and address a lot of those here right at the end. But I just want to say we've covered the math, we've covered the process, we've covered the financing. Let's bring it all together here with the most important question of all. Are you actually ready? And this is that practical readiness check that I like to share. And it's not about whether you can qualify for a mortgage. As we noted before, right? Banks and lenders have got pretty good at approving people who probably shouldn't be buying yet. And, this is about whether buying is the right financial decision for your specific situation right now. So on the renting side, if you're likely to move within 3 years, or Heck, your job situation is uncertain. Maybe you're still building your emergency fund, and maybe you ran those numbers of your local market and said, hey, local price to rent ratio, it's above 20 right now, that 15 and 20 bar, right? Well, these are genuine signals that renting is a smarter financial choice right now, even if we might feel really emotionally ready to buy. And maybe on the buying side, right? Hey, well, do we have a stable income? Do we have a 5+ year commitment to this? Do we have a full emergency fund? Is our total debt to income under 36%? Is the down payment ready without touching those retirement savings? And do we have a realistic expectation of, what is this going to ongoingly cost me as far as maintenance, right? These are all your green lights to check off. So I just want to be clear about one thing, right? Like the emotional pull to own a home is totally real and valid. Like I'm not discounting that, right? Building equity, putting down roots, having a space that's truly yours. Again, these all have real value that are not going to show up in a spreadsheet or a calculation here. And I'm not here to talk anyone out of buying. What we're here for is to make sure that when you do buy, it strengthens your financial position instead of undermining it. So to make this fully concrete, here are the 8 specific questions I'd encourage everyone to answer honestly before signing anything. First, what's your time horizon? If you're not planning on 5+ years, maybe reconsider, right? The research consistently shows that the minimum to make buying financially competitive with renting, to make buying more financially competitive, is about 5 years plus. Second, is your emergency fund intact? This one is non-negotiable for me. Buying without a fully funded emergency fund is how people end up in a financial crisis. Whether that's your HVAC system fails, your roof flies off, X, Y, and Z, right? You fill in the blank and we can get creative. But that's why it's so important, because otherwise, where do we tap into? You guessed it, consumer debt or retirement accounts, things we don't want to tap into. Third question, is your down payment ready? And remember, not only the down payment, but maybe closing costs and escrow costs as well. Fourth, is your housing payment at or below 28% of gross income, with total debt at or below 36% of gross income? Remember the 28 by 36 rule. It might help because that's what lenders are likely going to use to qualify you, but it's also the guardrail, I will tell you, that's going to protect you in your ability to keep investing after you buy. Okay, so use the guardrail. Questions 5, 6, and 7, those are, what's your job security? What's your location's long-term growth? Do you have any planned changes with your family, right? Children aren't cheap, but the family grows fast. Life happens fast, folks. Qualitative factors like that, right? They're not going to show up anywhere in a formula calculation, but to me, they do drive a lot of decisions, and sometimes the emotions might overtake and cost us costly mistakes. So the 8th question I always spend the most time on is, have you reviewed your financial foundations again, right? It's a framework I personally walk through with everyone who sits down with me. Are you capturing your employer match fully? Is your high interest debt cleared? Is your emergency fund funded? Are your retirement contributions on track, right? Only once all of those other boxes are checked too, does it make sense to layer in a home purchase. If you can answer yes to all 8 of those, well, hey, folks, you're in a strong position to move forward. And, if you can't yet, that's not a failure. That's useful information and exactly why we do the readiness check every time before we sign anything. Okay. Folks, that covers the core material for today, and it was a lot. I know it. This, again, as a reminder, is a recorded session. All of our prior webinars are on our YouTube page if you need them as well. But I'd love to hear from you. So if you have any questions, again, I'll circle back to the chat here. And if you'd like us to run any of this math against your own numbers, your income, your savings, whatever it may be, scan that QR code on the screen, schedule a one-on-one with us, and reach out directly with the contact information. We'd be happy to chat. So let's take a look here at a couple of chat's questions. I have a question from Jordan. Pre-approval step, should you request multiple offers around the same time to avoid multiple hard credit pulls? You're absolutely correct. 30 to 45 day window. So if you do multiple within that window, it only counts as one inquiry. So that's what I advise. Go shopping around. Do you recommend using a realtor or not? Could you use like ChatGPT to guide you in the process to save some money? Man, I just love the AI talk here. Absolutely, right? Like to me, I'm in the profession of the human business. I always think, and I would advise, use a realtor, but let's keep them humble, right? Let's use creative AI and let's make sure they're telling us the right things too. So answer your question, maybe a little bit of both. From Jordan, is the buyer's agent and seller paid? You're absolutely right. Majority of the time it can be standard, but sometimes you might have to request it. Always worth the chat too. Everyone's different. If we were to pay off all of our debts, so all debts are now zero, how long should you wait for your credit to update before you go for a pre-approval? Generally, I see them changing around 6 to 12 months, but it's always worth just to monitor them. You get one free credit report check a year from all the major bureaus, but generally, once all that debt is gone, I think that's always a myth of, hey, you pay all your debt off, you're not carrying any debts, right? How are you growing credit? The reality is still, I think, utilization outweighs that aspect, and your credit score is going to improve drastically, I'd say, in around 6 months to 12. Now, I do have a lot more chat questions coming in here. For the sake of time, I will follow up with all of you here and make sure those get addressed and answered. But before we close out, one last thing. Again, this session is part of an ongoing series, and next month we're shifting focus to a different stage of the financial journey. Your future self's favorite webinar, Retirement Made Easy. So if today was useful, I'd encourage you to join us for that one too. Scan the QR code on the screen to register. With that, folks, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. That is the end of our session. I wish you good luck on your own financial journey and a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you next month.